So I want to ask about the avant-garde in particular. Because what strikes me is that by talking about the modern, we may not always be talking about the avant-garde. And it seems to me that Rebecca, you brought up this question at the end of your talk about the relationship between Dorner and the avant-garde may have been, some sort of coincidental meetings. We see, for example, he does intersect with Lisitsky. Lisitsky, I think, is probably an avant-gardist in modernist clothing, or he's a modernist type avant-gardist. Thinks he is. Elio De Sica, and maybe to a certain extent Lina Bobardi, possibly count as avant-gardist in nature, but most of the rest of what you're talking about is the modern, to which the avant-garde is often opposed resolutely. So I'm just wondering if you can think, both of you, about the relationship between avant-garde and modernism as you dealt with it.
So I told Julian during the break that I wanted to pose the question of his group sitting up here in these chairs. What is the avant-garde anyway? But I withheld the question because I didn't want to open up the mess of asking it or to seem polemical. But I can't help but actually need to answer that question or to ask it, right? I guess we have different definitions here, right? There's a very specific project happening right here, like the Polish avant-garde started with a certain exhibition, and now it's 100 years later, and now we're going to revisit it. And very helpfully, today's proceedings were framed by the necessity of thinking about an avant-garde practice, especially in relationship to contemporary demagoguery, right? I mean, the necessity of understanding what it is to name a rupture in culture feels really useful in a way that it didn't when I was writing, these words about Alexander Dorner, just a couple of years ago, sort of rolling my eyes at his accidental sort of, tripping into this designation, this categorization of being seen as something like avant-garde, because he says he's proposing a rupture, but he's actually in every way completely suturing himself and his practice to the most canonical ideas of history. I'm sorry to say it's a real bummer, and I was disappointed to learn it too when I wrote this dissertation, but you just you can't change the history that you unearth. I don't know if I would agree with you that Lisitsky is fundamentally modern first. I mean, Lisitsky of all of these folks possibly is the one who actually does. And every time I talk about Lisitsky with Maria in the room, I'm getting super nervous because she'll tell us for sure. But my speculation is that Lisitsky, of all of these characters, Dorner or Sica, actually has a sense for what he understands a canonical practice to be and exactly how he sees himself breaking with it. I have the impression that your argument is that Oiticica could care less about whether he's making that distinction in his practice. I'll hand the microphone over, but not before I say that I think for me, because of the political situation that we are in right now, these questions of contingency versus autonomy, or whether we want to engage a practice of imagining something poetic and other and outside, or the entanglement of actually producing change. Someone earlier, I think it was you were making reference to the Lukács Adorno debate, right? These questions feel really, really important right now in a way that I'm kind of embarrassed to admit, because of course you're right that the whole category of the modern is in every way, I would completely agree, a canonical, colonial, deeply problematic set of pretexts. So maybe you can get us way outside of that framework. And I really appreciated your talk in sort of at least like opening a door to having this conversation in a different way. So thank you for that. And for your question.
Okay, thank you very much for that introduction. Well, definitely Elio De Sica and Lina Bobardi were dealing in this tension between the modern and the avant-garde, or how some people call it, the neo-avant-garde, the avant-garde. I'm not really agree with this idea of the neo or the post-avant-garde. But definitely it is related to how, like, at least in Brazil, for example, how all the modernization process of the city, the construction of Brasilia, the construction of all this rationalistic architecture deal as a sort of, how do you say, ovni, an object that arrived from an UFO, as a sort of UFO arriving to this tropical context, you know. So I think that Elio De Sica has the power, and Lina Bobardi the same, of tension those both concepts. But at the same time, the own concept of avant-garde, it is a colonial concept too. You know, when you apply it for somebody, or when you said like Elio De Sica is an avant-garde artist, you are imposing certain terminology that belongs to a certain tradition of art history. I'm thinking that and happen when Elio De Sica goes to the hills and pick up all these black people living there, not being artists, even people that is not even aware of the category of art, you know. And that work as a sort of imposition from the art system. That of course Elio De Sica was in New York in the beginning of the 70s. He was very much connected with MoMA, with many institutions in London too, whatever. So Elio De Sica play with those contradictions of also introducing popular culture inside the museum. Like, what the role of Elio De Sica is, it is also very problematic. And Lina Bobardi happened the same. You know?
I am not imposing the idea of the avant-garde on Elio De Sica. Elio De Sica navigated the idea of the avant-garde himself, and, you know, absolutely willingly. You know, it was a product of his own self-imagining, and drove his practice, you know, in a critical way.
No, of course he was. I will say that he was Western-centric, and he used that strategy and used his Brazilianness to be a particular character in the Anglo-Saxon world. You know, like with Guy Brett in the UK and everything. Like he knew how to play, and that's something that also I validated. You know, like, you have to play with your cards, you know, and that's what he did. Like, also, we have to say that Elio De Sica was a white gay guy dealing with black people, you know, and that's something also problematic. Yeah.
This will not be as generative a question as Julian's, but Rebecca, you mentioned briefly that Dorner was inspired by pragmatism, and I think you even mentioned. Did you mention John Dewey as well, or was I just?
I just made. I made the allusion, but yeah. That's true.
Okay. Could you say a bit more about that?
Sure. So Dorner had a fascination with John Dewey. John Dewey authored the introduction to The Way Beyond Art. Dewey did not. Dorner did not encounter Dewey's philosophy until he was in the U.S. I mean, the story is that he learned about Dewey from Carolyn McDonald, the education curator, who was studying at Teachers College at Columbia University. I don't have evidence to back that up other than just kind of like word of mouth back channeling. But But it is true that he adored Dewey. I mean, he there's an amazing quote in a letter that he wrote to Dewey. I'll have to find it for you, but it's like, your words hit me like, raindrops in a desert. I mean, he really loved Dewey. His idea of like what Dewey meant, though, may not have been Dewey's, and I think is that what your question is? Is like how much Dewey was Dorner really emulating?
There are many Deweys.
Yeah, I mean he. I think ultimately what fascinated him about Dewey was this idea that that Dorner really did think that he was not expressing a universal subjecthood. Mm-hmm. I don't think he did. I think he thought that he was doing something where each individual experiencer of like the world was going to be in this kind of productive discourse or entanglement with each other and the contexts around them, and like he shorthanded that American pragmatism. I guess there's more to say about that, but I'll leave it there. Yeah.
Right. Thank you both for those great thoughts. Yeah.